All right, this is a brief presentation on 20th century art. This art history overview is going to help tell the story of the complexities of the 20th century, but through that of art. So let's begin. To begin, let's make sure we understand where we're coming from. During the 1800s, we have the era of realism. This is both in art and in literature. Realism, like this Rembrandt piece, tries to show life as realistically as possible. Rembrandt, very famously known for his use of light in his paintings. Sometimes the realism shows simple day-to-day interaction, but also sometimes it shows historical events. Towards the end of the 1800s, we see the era of Impressionism. Now this is a Manet piece. You know of Monet and Manet. Manet still showing a bit of a realism in the sense of the topic. So the topic is day-to-day life. But the way the brushstrokes are made, it is not necessarily to look like a photograph. So it can be a little bit more vivid colors. It could be a little bit more abstract, but still the topic is obvious. Sitting at a cafe. Now, the next level. This is the turn of the century, the scream. This is Expressionism. You see similar paint strokes between Impressionism and Expressionism, but Expressionism purposely is taking kind of like an absurd piece, and it doesn't look like a real life setting. It's meant to be more expressive, emotional, and that is kind of what the 20th century is all about, showing our feelings in the more abstract way. An example of Expressionism is this Fauvism. This is a Matisse piece, A Woman with a Hat. Now, Matisse is a bit of Impressionism, Expressionism, but with bright, extreme colors. Fauvism was very, very brief. It was only a few years lasting, and this is just an example of a Matisse piece. As an art historian, they could probably go in greater detail. What I would just say is they take simple things such as an impressionist point of view, but with more bright abstract colors that are just not realistic. Because of that, you're supposed to feel a little bit more emotion. Now, this is still the early 1900s. This is before 1910. And you can see art is coming into its own and definitely leaving that world of realism. That gets it even more extreme in the interwar era. Now, the interwar era is going to have a lot of differences shown in these pieces. Cubism, here's an example of Pablo Picasso. The Three Musicians is maybe the most famous Cubist example. Do understand Pablo Picasso did a lot of different art, but this is definitely an example of modern art, a type of modern art. Because of the form it uses, it could just be more dynamic and it's open more to interpretation. And during the interwar era, an era where we kind of are a lost generation of souls trying to find who we are after the atrocities of World War I, trench warfare, and the gassing and the new mechanisms of death. You could understand we're trying to find who we are. So during the interwar era, and that's the 20s and 30s, a variety of forms come out. Now, besides Cubism, we have Dada or Dadaism. Now, Dadaism is hilarious in my opinion. They purposely tried to not be artistic. So, they made a little funny face on the Mona Lisa. Here, they took a urinal, put it on its side, and now they're calling it art. And they put a little fake signature acting like it was real art. In short, Dadaism was anti-art. and it was almost mocking and ridiculing the traditional art form by making obscene or irrational things become artistic. The Dada school is definitely a reaction to the realistic era that led into this World War I era of chaos. Georgia O'Keeffe, modern American modernism, obviously using bright, vibrant colors, but getting a close-up. And the focus is not necessarily the plant or the leaf or the flower as much as the color. I love Surrealism. I remember back when I was a kid and I tried to be cool in high school, I had this on a poster up on my wall in my bedroom, you know, me being such a surrealist individual. Surrealism is also an interwar era art form, and it is often taking obscene, absurd, extreme, technological, graphic items and pulling them together to purvey an emotion from the viewer. Now this is what I consider a commentary piece, Diego Rivera. This is going to be in one of the slideshows I show on Mexico, and it just shows an example of how what was going on in Mexico, the Mexico Revolution and the era that followed, the socialist era that followed it, you can see that being reflected in art. So this is art reflecting the chaos, art reflecting the time. And now after World War I, Picasso, now again using a kind of a Cubist form, is famously made Guernica. Guernica is Picasso's piece directly reflecting the horrors of the Holocaust, the genocide, the brutality of man towards man. And I would probably say Guernica has a very good chance on being on the AP test. It's on many AP practice tests, quizzes. It's in your textbook because it is art and history blended together. Now the era after the war era here. Okay, it's going to be followed by some definite outside the box stuff. So here's a piece of abstract expressionism. I actually had to Google what Jackson Pollock was. So he was an expressionist, but he was abstract. And I believe this is one of his paintings where he just splattered colors against a canvas, but supposedly did it in an artistic way. So good for him. Now, the work of Jackson Pollock actually kind of was sold by America as being a new wave form of art, and it showed that American arts and American culture are better and taking the next step globally. So actually Jackson Pollock and many of his peers will find that the arts are going to be funded by the federal government left and right with the hopes that this would combat the socialist, the communist world. So Pollock, not trying to say he's a capitalist, democratic, Republican man, but his art was sold as the new wave of American elitism. Now, I tried to find out what M.C. Escher was. M.C. Escher is after the war era, the 40s and the 50s. He is what we consider movementless, but you could definitely see how science and technology and mathematics blend in together. I remember the first time I ever learned about M.C. Escher was when in my algebra or algebra 1-2 class, and Mr. Ebert would pass these around, and for some reason I understood it better back then than I do now. Minimalists. I love this one, right? So minimalists, obviously in the 50s and the 60s, they use blocks, a simple block, a simple color palette as art. It is minimal, and of course you could peel back all the layers. For example, the layers, peel all these back. Peel back the layers. And this is what we get. What does this mean to you when you see this? Does this mean boldness? Does this mean passivity? Or does this mean aggressiveness? Minimalists, also an era of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. We're almost at the end now. This is just a piece of Soviet post-Stalin art. The post-Stalin art tried to glorify the pre-Stalin era. That's why you see Lenin sitting with the villagers, sitting with the proletariat, if you will, and talking about what needs to be done to help those people that are more downtrodden. It's kind of like going back to the glory era of the revolution, the ideals of the revolution before people are all being sent out to Siberia to live. I think this might be our last one. Good, it is. So let's go back. This is Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol is an example of the 60s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s pop art. Pop art is when you have art being part of popular culture. He designed the Campbell's soup can, which is very similar to the Campbell's can that we use today. This is him doing the different colored modes of Marilyn Monroe. Even his own visual was something that Andy Warhol marketed. And he was famous all the way through the 70s during the disco movement, the drug era of America. He's also famous for coming up supposedly with the phrase, everybody gets their 15 minutes of fame. Well, now that we're at 12 minutes, this is my 12 minutes of fame. You can see the 60s art. You can see post-Soviet. You see all the different art movements after World War II. And then, of course, the interwar era, going back to that transition era of realism through expressionism. All right? Hopefully you got a little something out of this. I would not be surprised if some of this ends up on the test and you have to kind of make some sense out of it. Just as long as you can put it in a chronological order, kind of connected to the global issues going on at the time, I think you're going to be fine. Have a good night.